Now in this video, let's talk about the idea called revelation. Not the book of Revelation here, but we're talking about the idea, sometimes also known as the doctrine of revelation, which has to do with how it is that we might arrive at knowledge of God. Put another way, revelation is the one-word answer to this deep question: what is the way, what is the method, if there even is a method, by which a mortal, material, human being like you and me might come to know an immortal, invisible, eternal God? In other words, how could humans even meet or know anything about such a God who, if he exists at all, transcends all of our normal experiences? How would we do that? Some people, a certain type of agnostic, would just say that in principle that we can't know if God exists or anything about him even. But more optimistically, the idea of revelation says that we can know, but we can only know what God chooses to tell us about himself. He'll have to reveal himself, give us his self-revelation, because he's not just a thing that's in the world that we can study like we study other things. As Martin Luther repeatedly said, God is, naturally speaking, hidden from our faculties. There's one famous Bible verse that anchors this idea of revelation, and it's Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. And that says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law." Now, what does that mean? Well, it's saying that God reveals some things about himself, and he gives that knowledge to us if we're willing to receive it. And it's like a gift that it now belongs to us, in a sense. And what he reveals is enough that we might know him, and it's enough that we might be able to follow him because of it and to even enjoy him. But he doesn't reveal everything. Some things will always remain his secret things, and we'll need to be somehow content in that, as hard as that sometimes might be. So Revelation says that God won't necessarily satisfy our desires for proofs of his existence. He won't necessarily give us humanly fathomable explanations for all of his ways. He won't even defend his justice to us sometimes. And by that I mean, and here's a common problem about believing in God that people have. If God reveals that he is perfectly powerful and that he is perfectly loving, which he does, but then he allows a terrible tragedy to transpire that has no obvious redemptive purpose or value. And if after that someone were to say to us, after seeing that tragedy, how can God really be both loving and powerful? Oftentimes the best answer is, I don't know how. I don't think he's revealed how something this terrible fits within his justice. I still believe that he is just and good because that has been revealed. And he's even shown that and demonstrated it in many ways. But the answer to your good question of how this particular tragedy could fit a good purpose, that is still very much hidden. So some things he reveals, and what he doesn't reveal can't yet be known by us. Now, I realize a lot of this can rub us the wrong way because human beings are designed to inquire, designed to question, and designed to desire knowledge of many kinds. And so if it rubs you the wrong way, let's just back up a bit. And what I'm about to say, it might help, it might not help, but just try it on for size. I think we'd all agree that how we come to know anything depends a lot on what it is that we're studying. The object of knowledge, the object of inquiry, often determines the best method of gaining that type of knowledge. So for example, if you wanted to know about ancient history, well, reading about it is probably the best method for most of us, unless you want to become an archaeologist yourself. But on the other hand, if you wanted to know about chemistry, you'd use different methods. You'd have to both read textbooks, very likely, and also you'd get yourself into a lab and you'd run some experiments and you'd use the scientific method, and that's how you'd make your discoveries. Or if, again, very differently, you wanted to know music, that was your object of inquiry. Well, reading about music theory will help for sure, but most people say the best method of learning music is to play music under the guidance of someone who really knows his or her way around a piano keyboard. And differently again, if you wanted to know yourself, if self-knowledge was your goal, and hopefully it is, the method of introspection, of looking within, maybe aided by a therapist, that might be the best way. So again, the object of knowledge determines the method of gaining that type of knowledge. So, okay, back to the idea of revelation. If you wanted to know the object of knowledge that we call God, to put it that way, you'd be right to expect there'd be still a different way of learning about him, a way that is probably different than any of the other ways you've used appropriately for other things. And why is that? Now you might say, look, can't I ask for scientific validation for God like I did with chemistry? Or can't I find God by just introspectively looking within myself and consulting my own intuitions and my own strong religious feelings? That method worked fine for self-knowledge, and it did. Or can't I judge God's actions in the world by the ethics that I learned in a philosophy class? Or the way that my grandmother taught me right from wrong? Now, that method helped me build my own knowledge, my own morality, so why not use that on God? Well, the Christian suggestion, as hard as this might be, has been always to say here that God is different enough from electrons, he's different enough from history, he's different enough from the piano, different enough from you and me even, that we shouldn't expect that any of the methods of knowing these other things would necessarily work with knowing God. In fact, he's so different that we won't really have a method at all. We'll simply have to be told. He'll have to reveal himself to us. So in other words, be careful about saying it's only rational to believe in God if I have this kind of evidence or that kind of proof. Be careful about saying I'll decide what to believe about God by looking within and listening to my own strongest intuitions. Thank you very much. Or be careful even about declaring that God is not knowable, because whether or not you realize you're doing it, you might be smuggling in some rules of what counts as knowable, rules that God doesn't actually submit himself to, and that aren't even really reasonable to apply to God, given his very different nature. You know, there's an old story. It's maybe apocryphal or apocryphal, I should say. Some say that it's a misquote of Nikita Khrushchev as he was giving a speech to some Soviet atheists. But this is the version of the story that's out there. Is that there was a Russian cosmonaut who was in fact the first person to enter into outer space, the first human in the 1960s. And he looked out the window of his space capsule as he was in orbit and he said, "I don't see any God up here." A good response to the cosmonaut would be to say, okay, but is there a reason to think that going into outer space is how we would prove or disprove God? Why would space travel be the method of validating the existence of an invisible spiritual being? So let's put it this way. If there is a God, if there is a transcendent, supernatural, personal creator who even created time and space, such a being with that kind of resume will probably just have to tell us about himself. And that telling is what we call revelation. Revelation is the process of God's own self-disclosure to us. And fortunately, he seems to disclose himself regularly in two main ways that I'll mention in a moment. But the big difference between knowing God and knowing many other things is that we're not in control of the process. He'll have to first come to us. He'll knock first to reveal himself in his way, on his terms. He'll need to give us the answers at the back of the book, so to speak, because we don't have the methods even to solve the problems of knowing his nature on our own. You know, the word theology, it sometimes gets translated as the study of God. And that strikes some people, and it strikes me too, as a little arrogant, as if somehow God is like in a petri dish and we're just poking around at him with our usual empirical methods of learning. Now, it's certainly true that we can and we should study what God has revealed. I mean, have at it. But in the deepest sense, in theology, we don't so much study God as simply receive and ponder what he has revealed to us and how we might live our lives differently in light of what he has revealed. So there's a humility, or there should be a humility, in doing theology. We're not really in charge of the process, and we're certainly not in charge of the content. Some have rightly said that we're all theologians because we've all made some conclusions, however tentative, about who God is or what he's like. But there certainly should be no cocky theologians, because we're always operating way downstream from the source, from the divine source of that truth. It's not that we can't know. We really can know, and we can know quite a lot about God, but we can only know what he reveals. That's the point of this idea of revelation. Now, very lastly, what he says about himself comes through two really wonderful channels that I'll have to get to another time, and which I mentioned briefly in another video. We call these two channels general revelation, and general revelation has to do with truth about God that he has placed in creation itself, and that he's even placed in our own conscience, actually. And then special revelation, which has to do with the much deeper truths that he reveals through the prophets and the apostles that become scripture. And in the Christian view, the high point of revelation comes in the person of Jesus himself, because Jesus becomes the lens by which all previous revelation comes into much more clear focus. But the very good news in this whole idea of revelation is that the God who reveals himself, this self-revealing God that we have, he has a number of attributes, a number of character qualities, a program for history, an embedded purpose to all human lives. There's a whole host of things that he reveals that you and I would never have come up with on our own. It's a much better version of God and of human purpose than we could create. That's one of my non-Christian friends once said to me, "I'm envious because you Christians have the best story." And I think that she's right, but it's a story that we all needed revealed to us. It's not one that we could have come up with on our own. And it is, in fact, discoverable by anyone who's willing not to somehow work for it and ascend to it as if that were even possible, but much more mercifully for those who are willing to just receive it. And so that's revelation, folks. We'll dive a bit more into these two channels in a bit, and there's more to come. So thank you for watching.